Well, it's really great to be here tonight. And what I want to do is talk tonight about different kinds of minds, talk some about autism, talk some about animals. I want to really get you thinking tonight. That's what I want to do. I want to get you to think about different ways of thinking. And I'm going to be talking about how I'm a total visual thinker. And it was a shocker for me to learn that there's other kinds of thinking too, that not everybody thinks the same way I think. In order to understand animals and autism, art, and mathematics, you've got to get away from verbal language. When I do my talks to the veterinary students and the animal science students, I say, you've got to get away from words. Dogs and cats don't, and horses and cattle, they don't think in words. And there's a whole world of thought and experience that's not verbal. An animal's world is sensory-based, a world of sight, sounds, taste, touch. I want you to shut your eyes, think about what you see. What could the dog be hearing? I want to get you more observant of the animal. I want to teach you how to observe. What are the ears doing? Then they point their eyes and ears towards stuff they're concerned about. What's the posture? Look at visual detail. Now, Van Gogh doesn't know anything about mathematics. And of course, it's one of the most famous paintings in the world. Since this is an art museum, I think it's a really good place to be showing it. And Van Gogh was putting mathematics into the turbulence patterns he painted in the sky. Because the mathematicians got a hold of this and analyzed it. And I don't think that Van Gogh realized that he was putting mathematical patterns in his paintings. What this shows is that visual thinking, mathematics, that's hidden underneath language. Because there's a type of Alzheimer's. It's called frontal temporal lobe dementia. And it wrecks the language parts of the brain. And I'm going to pick this up before I fall over it. It wrecks the language parts of the brain, and it wrecks the frontal cortex. And in some of these patients, visual thinking comes out. In fact, one patient, before the brain was completely trashed, patented a new design for a sprinkler head, of all things. Now, the mind of the person with autism looks for detail. So you got big letters here, and you got little letters. And the autistic mind will pick out the little letters faster. Now, I want to emphasize, autism is a very big continuum. It's a true continuous trait. The genetics is very, very complicated. It's little tiny code variations inside of genes, little additions of nucleotide pairs, little reversals, little deletions. And at one end of the spectrum, you're going to have individuals who are going to remain nonverbal. At the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have geeks and nerds. In other words, they're not that interested in people, but interested in things. There's a point where it's just going to be a personality variant. Einstein and a lot of school systems today to be labeled autistic, no language until age 3. Tesla, who invented the electric power plant, would be labeled autistic today. Mozart did a lot of strange kinds of behaviors. See, a little bit of this trait, you get a kid that's gifted in. Because you take out some of the social circuits, then you get circuits that do the good, fun, geek stuff, kind of stuff that I'm interested in doing. And then there's a point where it truly becomes an abnormality. But it's a true continuous trait. It's not like having tuberculosis, you've either got it or you don't. It's embedded in the genome. They are not going to find a single gene and get rid of autism. That's absolute rubbish. And there's a paper that just came out in Science recently about something, the Shank gene. Well, it's just a little code variation thing, and it's only going to account for about 16% of the cases of autism. It's complex genetics, totally embedded into the genetic code that develops the brain. That's simple. Now, the normal human mind ignores the details. There's been some very interesting research done by Dr. Nancy Minshew and her colleagues up at the University of Pittsburgh. And what was done in this experiment, they used functional MRI that measures how active different parts of the brain are. So they put an autistic person in the scanner, had them read out of a book. And their brain gets turned on just where the detail of the words is. Then they put the Asperger, that's the geeks and the nerds, and Asperger is just another word for geeks and nerds. I went to school with a lot of geeks and nerds. And who do you think's running Silicon Valley? Some of the people that are most important heads of large companies today, they got a lot of Asperger traits. And one thing that's concerning me today is a lot of these smart, geeky little kids aren't going anywhere. Well, they aren't getting enough discipline. Like, mother made me do table manners. She made me do please and thank you. Another thing that I had to do as a little kid is you'd go out and play with another kid, and you had to plan out how to build the treehouse. You had to learn how to negotiate with other people. Well, then the other person they put in the scanner was a normal person. Now, the thing that was really weird was the normal person lost the detail of the words. The Asperger got both the detail of the words and the overall whole. The normal person left out all the detail. Well, that can be a real problem if you're building a bridge because there's a lot of details, and if you forget those details, it might just fall down. Now, in my work with cattle, back when I started this back in the 70s, I was one of the first people to look at how vision affected cattle behavior. They were afraid of a lot of little things, like a chain hanging down, shadows, bright spots, seeing people up ahead. This particular place, the cattle were afraid to go into the veterinary building. And the owners of this place couldn't figure out why the cattle were afraid to go in there. Come on, it's a flag. It's right there. It's waving, it's rapid motion, weird noise, and very high contrast of light and dark that's moving. Sometimes the most obvious is the least obvious. The flag is right there staring at you in the face, and you don't see it. Look at how that animal's looking at that beam of sunlight. You know, now on a cloudy day, you're not going to have a beam of sunlight. And I would get down in the chutes and see what cattle were seeing. And when I first started doing this, people thought I was absolutely crazy. You know, looking at stuff the cattle were seeing, they just couldn't see the point of doing that. But since I'm a visual thinker, that seemed like an obvious thing to do. If you're a verbal thinker, it wouldn't seem so obvious. I'd get down the chutes and see what they're seeing. The movie did an absolutely fantastic job of showing how my visual thinking mind worked. I really loved the fact they duplicated all my projects exactly. That really turned me on. And that DVD, by the way, has a really great commentary track on it where Mick Jackson, Christopher Munger, the writer, and I talk about cattle handling, and we also talk about autism. But look how you got shadows there. Now, on a cloudy day, you won't have the shadows. Well, the cattle will stop and put their head down and look at the shadows. But most people would just get more prods and just start hitting them and trying to push them. No, you use behavior. You get those distractions out of there, they'll walk right up there. I get asked all the time, are cattle scared of getting slaughtered? That's a question I had to answer very early in my career. So I'd go over to the Swift plant, and it was renamed Abbott for the movie because Swift still exists. And then I'd go out to the ranch in the feed yard and I'd watch cattle go up the veterinary chute. They behaved the same way in both places. If they knew they were going to get slaughtered, they should be a lot wilder at the slaughterhouse than at the feed yard, but that just wasn't the way it was. And if you got rid of the things they're scared of, they'd walk right up the chute. And when I did the animal welfare work for McDonald's, I developed a very simple scoring system. Instead of somebody just walking into a plant and saying, well, is that plant good or bad? I just developed a thing that was simple, like traffic rules. You know, the police, they measure speed, and then, okay, running red lights and stop signs, you're not allowed to do that. And they also get you for erratic driving. But there's very specific things that they look for. So you measure how many cattle were bellowing their heads off just as they were going up into the slaughterhouse. You're only allowed 3 out of 100. If more than 3 cattle out of 100 moo up, and as they walk up the chute, you fail the McDonald's audit. You're only allowed 1 animal falling down and you fail the audit. It was numerical scoring. It worked really, really well. If you want to read about it, I got lots of stuff on my website at grandin.com. Look at how the zebra and the horse have an ear on each other, and the other ear's on me. And the movie does a fantastic job of showing that. When I talk to the vet students and animal behavior, I want to get you looking at these things. What are some of the signs that your animal's scared? Horses and cattle, the whites of the eyes will start to show, and their tail will start switching. In dogs, they're wagging their tail like that, that's happy. But in horses and cattle, and they're going like this, they're not happy. If they're switching their tails all the time, that's a horse or cow that's starting to get stressed. You know, they'll tell you before they kick your head off. You just got to make sure that you read the body language. Now, I see movies in my head, and this is a picture that a young man sent to me to show how he has movies in his head. That's exactly how I think. Now, I used to think that everybody thought in pictures. I didn't know that other people think differently until I wrote my book, Thinking in Pictures. And I started interviewing people about how they think. It was a real revelation. And one of the things that first started making me think about it is I got a review of Thinking in Pictures on Amazon.com that basically just said, Well, there are people on the spectrum that don't think in pictures. Now, of course, that kind of stung. But then I thought, well, I better investigate this. And I found out that they were different ways of thinking. Some people with autism think in pictures, others don't. But the thing is, the person with autism tends to have uneven skills. Good at one thing, bad at something else. And I was good at art, and my mother always built up my ability in art. That was always encouraged. She also encouraged me to make pictures of many different things. Otherwise, I would have just drawn horses or nothing else. Now, I realized my thinking was different when I asked other people about church steeples. Okay, think about church steeples. I was shocked when I found out what other people saw. Most people told me they just see this generalized, generic one. Now, I'd asked people before about seeing a house or car. Most people will see their own house or car because they're so familiar with it. But I asked something you're less familiar with, like maybe a factory. Okay, well, if you live next door to one, then you'll see the one that you live next door to. A boat, a church steeple, something you don't own. Then the image got more generalized. And what neuroscience shows right now is this generalized one is coming out of the association cortex. I'm going all the way back into the visual cortex. I see only specific steeples. I see a whole bunch of specific pictures, and I have to put them in the church steeple file folder in my brain. It's bottom-up thinking. It's not top-down. And they flash up in my mind as a set of still slides like Google for images. And if I hold one of those slides in my mind, I can turn it into a video. They just kind of just flash up like this, just like they did in the movie. And then if I hold it still, I can go, would you like a snowstorm there? Would you like a wedding there? You know, whatever. I can like test run it in my head. I didn't know that other people couldn't test run pictures in their head. This is one of my cattle handling facilities, and you might wonder why curved. Cattle like to go back to where they came from. So you got to lay out the full circle so they go back to where they come from. And when I design things, I can test run them in my head. I didn't know that the other designers couldn't do this. And I actually got into a giant fight in a job down in the 70s, and I didn't know this because we were building some meatpacking plant stuff. And I go, if you make that piece of equipment that way, it's going to pull the rail out of the ceiling. The whole rail's just going to come crashing down. And it did. You see, because in my mind, I could test run it. Now I realize today that they're not able to see it. But they're good at doing things I'm bad at doing, like a lot of mathematical things. And there's the cattle handling facility that HBO built in the movie. Boy, this really turned me on to see this. And there's a scene in the movie where they put a metal slide in and they drown the cattle, and that actually happened. They really messed up my design. They couldn't get the idea of letting them walk in down a ramp that's non-slip. And today, with my center track restrainer, a piece of equipment I designed for the big meat plants, people are still making the ramp slippery. They're making the same mistake. And I've got lots of YouTube videos that show these things. I always like to show my drawings off. Now, we've just got a so-so projector tonight. It's not showing them off too good. This nice monitor down here showing them off just great. But when you're a geek and when you're a nerd, one thing I learned very early on is I had to sell my work rather than myself. People thought I was really weird, but when I wrote for the Farm and Rangeland magazine, I wrote really good, accurate articles. And when I went to sell jobs, I'd show people my drawings. Then I got respect. I remember going to an agricultural engineering meeting in the early 70s, and they wouldn't even talk to me until I whipped out one of my drawings. And they go, "And you drew that?" Yeah, I did. And there's the actual drawing for the dipping vat system I designed for John Wayne's feed yard, and it's the John Wayne. 26-bar Red River Cattle Company. Now, I have a class where I have my students actually lay out and design a cattle handling facility. And one thing I'm getting concerned today, there's a lot of courses, you got to regurgitate a lot of multiple choice stuff. And what this teaches the students is how to solve a visual problem. And when I was first learning how to do drawing, I had to learn how to relate the lines of the drawing to the actual real facility. So I have my students take this drawing and walk through the real facility. And then I, can switch that back and forth like that. And you might wonder about the curves there. You got to lay them out right. As they're coming on around the bend, they think they're going back to where they came from. We're going to use that behavior to help us. But I had to learn, because how to relate the more abstract drawing to the actual thing. So what I did is I got this drawing for the whole entire Swift plant. And I spent 2 days in the Swift plant with the drawing in my hand, the layout drawing of the whole plant. And I walked around in the plant until I could look at every line on that drawing and relate it to something in the plant. Like the big circle was the water tower, and this little square was a concrete column that held up the building. And this other oval thing, that was the vat they put the hides in. This other square building, that was a cattle buying office. This little thing that goes like that, that was a door. Then the way they did some other little lines, that was a window. I was really good at designing and building things, but I would just go out in the shop and do it. I had to learn how to take the shop and put it on the paper so that I could design bigger projects that other people would build. Okay, I've observed a very interesting, kind of disturbing phenomenon as the meat industry, and I've done design work for all the major companies. Half the cattle in this country handled in a center track restrainer system that I designed for meat plants. And I watched the designers in my industry go from paper drawings into computers. Now, when the old folks switched over, everything was fine. But I noticed an odd, disturbing thing. When some of the young guys would come in, you get a guy maybe 22 years old, he's taking a course in CAD drafting, but he's never built anything, and he's never drawn by hand. And I was getting drawings from every single major meat company with strange mistakes on them, like not knowing where the center of the circle is. They were not seeing it because they'd never taken a compass and actually had rotated it around, or taken the gate and swung it around the crowd pen. They had never built anything. And I had this happen, 5 or 6 major companies. And when I tracked back the history of that drawing, it was always some young guy that had never had any hands-on experience. And I think hands-on experience teaches important skills. Now, someday in the future, you'll be able to take Google SketchUp, maybe put on an electronic glove and feel the thing you drew. Okay, but until you're able to do that, I'm going to insist on hand drawing and building things, because you've got to get that touch feedback. There's a very interesting chapter that Oliver Sacks wrote about a person that was blind all his life, and then as a grown-up, he had cataracts taken off, and he didn't know how to use vision. He looked at this little black and white thing, and he didn't know what it was until he touched it. It was his dog. He didn't know what a cup was looking at it until he actually handled it and felt it. He didn't know how to use vision until he started touching. And then they'll have gates that don't swing correctly. Now, certain autistic kids, oftentimes drawing skills will show up. On a lot of these milder autistic kids, kind of the Asperger kids, which is just milder ones, around 3rd or 4th grade, that's oftentimes where the uneven skills will show up, where they'll be bad in one thing and good at something else. And we need to build up the thing that they're good at. I used to joke around that I had a huge internet trunk line deep into my visual cortex. Okay, I'm on the right-hand side. This is tensor imaging. It measures huge myelinated internet superhighways in the brain. And mine's really big, and it goes way back because the visual the graphics files are here. This is parietal here. That's more of the mathematics area, pattern thinking. This doesn't go back all the way. Okay, then we take a slice up here, and it's a real big one. It goes all the way back. And when I got these scans, that's on the right-hand side, too, I'm like going, wow. I really do have a big internet line. I mean, that just blew my mind. And then another scan that was done, they played on me all these weird videos while I was in the functional MRI, and I was more interested in looking at things than looking at people. Well, the thing is, you need to have some people interested in things, or we'd still be living in caves, because who do you think made the first stone spear? It certainly wasn't the social yakety yaks. That's for sure. Now I want to show you another kind of mind. I figured out after the Amazon review got written on thinking in pictures in the mid-90s that there were visual thinkers and they were verbal thinkers. But now I figured out that visual thinking kind of has another subcomponent called pattern thinking. I think in photorealistic pictures, but there's another kind of mind that thinks in patterns. These are your computer programmers, your engineers. They're into chess, they're into mathematics, and into organic chemistry. Now, up there is a praying mantis made out of a single sheet of folded paper. No Scotch tape, no cutting. And what you see there in the background is the folding pattern. Now, this is not my mind. This is the mind of the pattern thinker. I think in photorealistic pictures. And there's actual brain scan research. You know, when I can't sleep, I go surfing on the internet. And I went surfing on the internet. I got into Google Scholar, and I was looking at citations on some other rather boring paper. But I looked at the citations, and I found this really cool paper on PET scanning that showed that the photorealistic visual thinker and the pattern thinker use different parts of the brain. Okay, this is an important slide. I'm a photorealistic visual thinker, and I absolutely can't do algebra. And I had another brain scan that was done at the University of Utah, and I've got a defect in the parietal cortex, and I have a very, very bad working memory. I have tons and tons and tons of hard drive space, and my mind is just like Google for images. But in order for me to really think, I had to get out and see a whole lot of different things. I had to read a whole lot of different things. You got to get these kids out doing stuff, because you got to fill up the internet that's in their head with a lot of experiences. Because to understand something in the future, I got to compare it back to something in the past. And when I was 15 and had a chance to go to my aunt's ranch, I was scared to go. Not going was not going to be an option. The choice was 1 week or all summer. But you know, you got to push them something to do things. I absolutely couldn't do algebra. And one of the mistakes made in my education was to pound away on algebra instead of going to geometry and trig. And I'm finding a lot of students that can do geometry and trig but can't do algebra. And the verbal thinkers say algebra is a prerequisite for geometry. And I go, well, that's really interesting. Geometry was invented before algebra. Well, then that shuts them up. But so how did I get through college? I got to thank educational fads, because in the early 60s when I went to college, we had to do finite math. Instead of algebra, it was probability matrices and statistics. Had to be tutored, but more visual. Then you got the pattern thinking mind, the music and math mind. These kids often have trouble with reading. This is a little kid that when he's in 4th grade, you better move him 3 grades ahead in math, because if you don't, he's going to become oppositional defiant. I think that's kind of a ridiculous label. You know, the thing you got to realize about these diagnostic things, they're not precise. And right now, all the committees arguing over the revisions in the diagnostic manual. They're going to take Asperger's out and merge it all into autism. Scientifically, it is truly continuous. But I'm worried about what that's going to do to service providers. Then you've got the verbal mind. These are the kids that love history. These are the kids that know all kinds of facts. Their math skills are average, and they are not a visual thinker. You see, so they're good at writing. And then I had a dyslexic student that was an auditory thinker. Not really a word thinker, but auditory. She was very much tuned in to what things sounded like. Okay, I got this book, Perfect Rigor. And this really turned me on, because you can look at this formula, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or you can do it with a pattern thinking method, and you've got this pattern, a right triangle with squares. Now, the reason why, for someone like me, it'd be easier to understand a pattern is it puts no load on working memory. I had a horrible time in physics with those physics problems. They'll say something like, one plane takes off from LaGuardia and that's going this many miles per hour, and another plane takes off from Chicago and it's doing this, and it's got a headwind of this. You know, what point will they meet? There's too much load on working memory. Now, the only way I could learn how to solve those problems would be to take the formulas for different things and figure out how the problems fit different patterns of the formula. Like go out and buy 10 physics books, sit down with a tutor and say, okay, for these speed problems, I can make the formula go 3 different ways, catalog these problems on a spreadsheet and just get to where I could pick out a certain pattern, because I got no working memory. at all. I mean, I can't hold one piece of information in my mind while I manipulate something else. But boy, I got tons and tons and tons of hard drive space. More hard drive space than most people have. That's sort of how it works. Now, how do I form a concept when I got all these individual discrete pictures? Well, this little boy sent me this showing how he has boxes in his brain and he's sorting cats and dogs into different categories. Well, I take all the church steeples and I put them in one box. How about cell phone towers? Okay, they go in another box. That includes the Hilton Hotel in Fort Collins because it has cell phone towers on top. Even some churches are going to go in that category because they're renting out their steeple. So there's a situation where it could go into either one of those categories if the church steeple's got cell phone transmitters inside it. Now, when I'm thinking about these things, the pictures flash up. I saw the Hilton Hotel. I'm seeing these disgustingly ugly fake tree cell phone towers. Dumbest thing. They look like some prehistoric tree out of a science fiction movie. But I see the individual different things. A dog will form categories. Like when I'm on the leash, I protect my owner. When I'm off the leash, I can go play. You see, for me, making categories, that's the beginning of concept formation. So how are you going to teach an autistic kid a concept like not being rude? You're going to just have to go out in the community, and when he does something that's rude, you're going to have to say, put that in the rude file folder. Okay, sticking your tongue out in church is rude. Spitting in public is rude. Pushing in line at the movie theater is rude. And you just do it by specific example out in the real world. We got to get these kids out and doing things. Like if I took my fork and I twirled it around, Mother would say, put your fork back down on the table. If I picked up the meat with my hands, Mother would say, use the utensils. She would just give me the instruction. I think sometimes too many of these kids are coddled. I'm seeing smart 12-year-olds where nobody ever taught them how to order food at a restaurant. Well, that's just ridiculous. By the time I was 7 years old, I could go in the newsstand, buy a kite. I knew I wasn't supposed to stand there and read all the magazines without buying them because you only touch the things you're going to buy. You know, and I don't sit in the airport and read all the magazines, and I buy plenty of magazines in the airport, but I have stood in the bookstore, and I'm a speed reader. I have read books in Barnes & Noble, well, Barnes & Noble at least provides chairs. Airport bookstore, I have read books in the airport bookstore. And just talking about reading, when I first started out learning reading with the Dick and Jane books, I was terrible. Then Mother taught me with phonics, and then I caught on really quickly. And some kids are going to learn with phonics, but other autistic kids, it's going to be sight words. So use the method that works. Now, here's another example of categories in the brain of an animal. In the mind of this horse, a man on a horse and a man on the ground are two totally different things. You see, it's a different picture. And you could have a horse that's been abused by the horseshoer, and he's going to get scared for anything with people on the ground. But when you go to ride him, he's fine. See, that's a different picture. The cattle are the same way. If those cattle have been trained, then they get used to a person on a horse, they might be very tame, and you can get really close to them when you're riding the horse. But if they've never seen you on the ground, then they panic. You see, you need to train them to tolerate both the person on the horse and the person on the ground. And you can get similar situations with a kid with autism. Things don't generalize. If you want to teach a concept like not running across the street, you better teach it in 10 different places. Because if you just teach it at home, he might think it doesn't apply at school. Well, it applies at school, it applies at the Joneses, it applies at the library. A whole lot of different places. Now, I'm finding that professionally, in working on equipment, I'm finding that normal people are having a hard time differentiating something wrong with equipment from something the people are doing wrong. To me, this is very easy to differentiate. But I find a lot of my clients have difficulty doing this. And when we're doing a startup on a piece of equipment, they don't seem to be able to tell a major design fault, in other words, project real, true, project failure mode, from glitches. I've had probably 5 or 6 different plants where I've told them that when we start up this equipment, do not put old, worn-out trolleys on brand-new cooler rail because they jam. You need to buy new trolleys. Well, they want to be cheap and they don't buy new trolleys, and then they jam. And then that causes a ton of downtime, and the plant manager's out there throwing a fit. And then they're up there grinding the rail to make it fit the crummy old trolleys. Well, that's a glitch. That's not a major design fault. And to me, being a visual thinker, it's very, very easy for me to categorize these problems out. So if it's a glitch, I just let them throw a fit. If it's something that can be a major design fault, then I'm panicking. When I was developing my center track restrainer system, the plant manager comes running out and he said, it's wrecking the hides. And I go, yeah, that's real serious. Well, I run down to the hide room in a panic, and there was a tiny cut this big on the hide, and all it was a rough edge, and we ground it off with the grinder like in 5 seconds. And I'm like, oh, wasn't a major design thing. But for a minute there, I was really, really scared. Okay, here's where you had a problem out here with BP with categorization. They were very proud of the fact that they had drastically reduced slips and falls on oil rigs. You could get written up for safety violation if you walked around an oil rig without a lid on your coffee cup, because you might spill the coffee and slip and fall on your little tuchus while walking down the stairs or going around on these catwalks. Yeah, but they hadn't thought about the big important thing, process safety. Things like you got the big pipe, and then you got to keep a little pipe in the middle of the big pipe, and you got to put these things in there called centralizers, and they didn't use enough of those things, and they didn't do the cementing right. They had thought about one category of safety, but process safety, let me tell you, they had totally forgotten about that. And then I've been following the whole nuclear reactor mess over in Japan. I've been reading all the articles on it very, very carefully, and they made a design mistake I would not make. You see, the mathematics thinker, he designs the reactor, but I'm the one that can, like, in my mind, play out the scenarios of something that could destroy the reactor. I went on the internet at 3 o'clock in the morning when I couldn't sleep. I looked up all the rules for nuclear power plants. I found manuals for operating nuclear power plants. I read a chapter in a book about all the different designs of them. And they talked about redundancy of backups. Okay, you've got to have a backup for your emergency generator, so when the power lines break, you've got an emergency generator that runs your emergency cooling pump so the plant doesn't melt down. Then they got this big seawall here. They didn't have a backup for the seawall. Yeah, they had 2 generators, but they were inside a non-waterproof building. So what happened, when the earthquake hit, didn't break anything. All the emergency systems came on, emergency pumps were running, the generators are running, everything was cool, everything was nice. 30 minutes, an hour later, tsunami breaches the seawall and drowns the generators that are not in a waterproof building. Now, if I had walked around in that plant, I would have looked at that seawall and gone, water coming over the top of this, seawall breaking, generator building over here, doesn't have submarine doors. What's going to happen? Now, the nuclear reactor, that's for the pattern thinkers. But I understand the pumps and I understand the generators, and I just know that they got to keep running. And generators don't work when they get wet. And the electric panels that supply the generators are going to fry when they get wet. It's that simple. I'd see that. Another design mistake a visual thinker doesn't make is the airbags that were killing babies. Okay, the engineers just blindly followed the spec. It's got to hold in a full-grown man with no seatbelt. Well, I would have watched those crash dummy videos, and I would have put a baby in there in my mind, and I would go, wait a minute, this is not going to work. See, the thing is, you need to have the different kinds of minds work together. Let's take something like the iPhone 4. Well, the different minds there failed to work together. Where on the iPod, they worked together. They worked together beautifully. The iPod, the little music player, was designed by a fine arts major, and the engineers had to make it work. And the 2 worked together, and it was just wonderful. iPhone 4, pretty, beat out the laws of antenna design. So your hand went against the antenna and messed up the reception until you put duct tape on it. Now you get these like really disgusting cases to put on it, keep your hand off the antenna. But when the 2 kinds of minds really work together, it's great. Because I find with my students, they're really good at the statistics. That's the stuff I can't do. But where I'm really good is figuring out the methods of the experiment. Because I can visualize how that experiment is done and making sure it's not confounded. Both animals and people with autism are bottom-up thinkers, not top-down. I'm a bottom-up thinker. I take all the details, put them together like a puzzle to form the whole. I make my concepts by categorizing specific examples. Top down gets the concept first. And I'm getting very concerned. We got a lot of problems in today's society. And what's happening to the top-down thinkers is they're getting too far away from practical things. Things are getting more and more ideological because they're not doing practical stuff. People don't come off the farm anymore. And I call it abstractification. I think we got to get back to doing stuff. Bottom-up thinking makes it easier to put information in different categories because everything's specific examples. The thing I want to emphasize is there's a place for the different kinds of minds. We need all the different kinds of minds. And where are all the old aspies? One of the questions that's supposed to be answered, at the end, but I'm going to answer it right now, was why is there so much autism and stuff in Indiana? Well, you've got, I think some severe autism's increased. There's definitely been some increases there. But you take your geeks and your nerds, they're living in a looser society today where social rules aren't pounded in, because where are all the old geeks and nerds my age? They're all employed. Oh, go on United Airlines. I was just talking to some of the gate agents from United Airlines. I said, you got some mechanics out there that I know are Asperger's. And this airline wouldn't run without those mechanics. And they managed to keep these jobs. I go out to a meat packing plant, and this guy with this big ponytail, he's my age, comes up, and he started out gutting hogs, but then he went to boiler school, and now he fixes all the boilers. And you have to be licensed to fix boilers. They don't let just any nincompoop fix boilers. There's definitely a place for these people. We need to get the different kinds of minds to work together because they can complement each other, especially when you kind of realize the differences. Let's look at the visual thinker and the word thinker working together. Mick Jackson, the director in the movie, was a total visual thinker. But one of the problems with the visual thinker is a ramble and they don't have linear structure. So Mick and Christopher, the writer, worked together. Mick was constantly changing the script. But he didn't change it until Christopher worked on it because Christopher gave it the linear structure. Otherwise, all the flashbacks wouldn't have worked. Because if you look at one of Mick's earlier movies, L.A. Stories, very cute, but it doesn't have much structure. And Christopher gave it the structure. Mick would change one little thing and he'd call Christopher. And that's what made it work. That's a perfect example of the two kinds of minds working together. They complement each other. And you can have real successes when the different minds work together. We need to be doing more of that. One of the things that really helped me when I was in high school was my science teacher, and he got an honorary doctorate for the movie, and he got me motivated to study. Now, when I was in high school and boarding school, I wasn't doing any studying, but I was learning lots of work skills. When I was 13, I did a seamstress job. When I was 15, I took care of 9 horses every day, cleaning their stalls. I shingled the barn. I built things. When I was in college, I interned in a research lab. I'm seeing too many of these smart and quirky, nerdy kids graduating from college and then they can't get employment. There needs to be a lot more work on learning work skills. But I wasn't studying. And then I got shown the movie about the optical illusion room. I got fixated on that. Now, my science teacher got me motivated to study, because if I wanted to become a scientist, then I had to study stuff I wasn't interested in, like English and history. I can't emphasize enough mentor teachers like this. And I think it's a shame that so many schools are taking out the hands-on classes. And what's happening is the community colleges are getting the classes, and I think that's just great. But the thing is, we need to be getting these kids turned on to this stuff in middle school. Because what I'm seeing now, I'm seeing a lot of smart, quirky kids getting so addicted to video games, they don't do anything else. I am concerned that our educational system is failing to stimulate and educate the visual and the pattern thinker. That they kind of, too many of them, I think, are getting labeled handicapped. Because the problem is, you got a lot of educators that have totally gotten away from the world of practical things. And this paper came out 10 years ago, and this educator here is very concerned about visual thinking being overlooked by educators. And people think, well, we can't do art anymore in the schools because we got to pass the tests. Well, I just gave a talk 2 days ago to Colorado business leaders, and they were telling me about a school in Loveland, Colorado, where the students build a house, and they have to do geometry and math, and they're building the house, and they're getting great scores on international tests. No, I think it's a mistake to taking these things out. It's a shame so many of these things are gone, because oftentimes it's the shop teacher or the auto mechanics or the art teacher or the music teacher that gets some of these kids turned around. Well, here's the stuff I did in high school. These are the things that saved me. And I was teased and teased and teased and teased in high school. It was horrible. They called me workhorse. They called me tape recorder. I couldn't figure out why they called me tape recorder. Well, it's because I always repeated the same words. And the only refuges I had away from teasing were horseback riding, science lab, and these kind of specialized activities. They just saved me. And I'm saying too many, these quirky kids just going nowhere because we don't have mentors to mentor them. Now, there's a lot of people going into retirement. There's a lot of retired engineers, artists, musicians, chemists, biologists that would love to go into high school and just teach a science class. But they don't want to get an ed degree. We need to somehow get rid of that. That's just stupid. You know, I think the qualification for a high school biology teacher is he needs to have a degree in biology, and he needs to have worked for at least half his professional life in something to do with biology. And I'm not suggesting just dump him into the class. No, he needs to have somebody with him, ease him into the class, but he shouldn't have to be taking all these courses. Big corporations need to invest in the future. I'm very concerned that our country is kind of eating the seed corn by not investing in universities. We have one of the greatest university systems, and we're losing, getting cut back on funding and cut back on funding, and these are the places where you educate the minds of tomorrow. I'm very concerned as faculty members that are my age retire. We're going to have the funding to replace them. I want to talk about a few sensory things that can really mess you up in school, and there's some very simple things that you can do to fix them. And in a lot of different labels, dyslexia, head injury, oppositional defiant, I don't understand that as a medical diagnosis. I think that's BS. I'm too much of a hardcore neuroscience background. You can get sensory problems like sound sensitivity, visual sensitivity problems. And when I was a little kid, and when the school bell went off, hurt my ears like a dentist drill, just going into a nerve. It was terrible. High-pitched sounds were the worst. Now, sometimes you can get the kid desensitized to this if he initiates the sound. The sound that the kid initiates is better tolerated. Now, one of the reasons why I don't want photography during my talk is because if someone's out here walking around, it attracts my attention, and then I have real slow attention shifting. Processing speed of my brain is slow. It takes me much longer to shift back and forth. I'm not good at jobs that require a lot of multitasking. Like a receptionist in a busy office and type at the same time. That's not going to work with me. Now, another problem that a lot of kids have, and a lot of grown-ups have too, about 5% of the population, is when they go to read, the print jiggles on the page. Because there's something wrong with these circuits back here in the visual cortex that assemble the visual image. You see, back in here, you have shape, color, motion, and texture circuits. Scientists know where they're located, because when people have strokes, weird things happen, like when the motion circuits don't work. When you pour coffee, it's a series of still images. Makes it really hard to pour coffee. And one simple thing that you can do for this is try on pale colored glasses. If you're one of these people that hates fluorescent lights because you see them flicker, can't stand driving at night, you don't like escalators, go down to Walmart or something and try on all the pale pinks, the pale blue, just a lot of the real pale glasses, and you find the right color, the print no longer jiggles. Try putting the homework on different pastel papers. I have a lot more information on all of these things in my Way I See It book. There are just some of my books. And I guess the next thing that we're going to do, I'll put my Grandin.com up there if you want to look at my livestock stuff. I got lots of livestock stuff on Grandin.com. And I guess the next step they're going to do is they're going to put some slides up here of questions. Then I'll answer the questions, and then I'm probably going to disobey the rules and do a few questions off the audience. I'm not supposed to, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions that farmers or the general public have about animal behavior? One of the things that bothers me today is there's a tendency when you have a problem, well, we just throw a drug at it. And we have the same problem in autism. Do you have a behavior problem or do you have a biological problem? Like in nonverbal autistic kids, the first thing you better look for is a hidden painful medical issue. Like maybe they got acid reflux, heartburn, something like that. It's getting people to recognize the importance of behavior, to use behavior to control an animal rather than force. I had a lovely lunch yesterday with my graduate student Ruth, and we talked about her mare. And usually when a mare has a baby, it goes and hides, doesn't want any people around. Well, this mare waited until Ruth got back home. She trusted Ruth so much, when she got back home, she'd run over to Ruth and had the colt right there in front of Ruth, like kind of saying, oh, now you're here to be with me. It's my first baby, and I'm really scared. And that's an example of using behavior. When I first started my work on showing how shadows and reflections and things like this scared animals, I found that some people got it and other people didn't. It's like the thing in the movie where they put that metal plate in there. That was shown absolutely accurately. Behavior is important. And I find that veterinary students, the SCADMA clubs, invite me to give talks. And our veterinary school happens to have a really good animal behavior program, but unfortunately there's about 25% of veterinary schools that don't even have a dog and cat behavior program. Well, when you think about it, half of all pets are put down because of behavior problems. Behavior is really, really important. But there's certain people, again, it's go throw a drug at it. And I had one girl in the class that the only note she took in the class was when I mentioned using a drug. And she didn't write down anything when I just talked about the behavior stuff. Sometimes you need medication, but it shouldn't be the first thing that you do. Okay, we can put the next one up there. I heard you say that art was one of your best subjects in school. Can you say something about the value of visual thinking? I think I've already talked a whole lot about this. And there's a huge value to visual thinking. And this is where the visual thinking and the engineer need to work together. Let me tell you another little secret about designing meatpacking plants. They hire a guy with the title of draftsman. That's the guy that's the visual thinker. Guess what? He actually designs the plant, lays out the whole entire plant, these big, complicated meat plants, and the engineers have to calculate the steel and do the engineering stuff, but the engineers don't lay out the plant. The visual thinker does. And you need to have the two working together. Then you get really, really great projects. Okay, we can go on to the next one. We are such fans of your books and your work. Personally inspired by your story. Have you ever considered writing a book for children on the spectrum? Yes. Right now, I'm working with with Cy Montgomery, and we're going to be coming out with a children's kind of version book about my life. I'm going to be talking about, all the kites that we made. We actually found pictures of some of my kites. I was really into kites as a child, constantly experimenting with different kinds of kites. I made this bird kite that I flew behind my trike that had little winglets that bent up, and the ratio of the wing area to the wingtip bent up was the same as what's on an airliner today. And when I saw those little wingtips on the airliners, I went, oh, wow. I was the 6 when I made those. Okay, Indiana's ranked 7th in autism. Some of this is increased detection. I think that truly there has been an increase in some of the severe autism, especially the regressive autism, where the kids get some language and then they lose it. But then on the other end of the spectrum, over the last 5 or 6 years, I'm seeing like milder and milder kids coming up to me at the book table, ones that when I was in school, they would have just been kind of the geeky, nerdy kids. And if they're out in Silicon Valley, those kids get apprenticed into the computer industry. See, one of the things that's a problem is I think a lot of special educators do a great job with the more severe kids, but since they're not from a technical background, they don't know what to do with a math whiz or somebody that's interested in engineering. They just don't understand that sort of stuff. Now, I think it's important to learn how to be social, but you can't de-geek the geek. You can't make the geek into something that they're not. And to me, really cool stuff. One of the things I had to learn is I had to learn to control the emotion of aggression, because I was thrown out of ninth grade for throwing a book at a girl who teased me, and after I had horseback riding taken away for 2 weeks, I switched to crying. Because you see, you're missing a few circuits here, so you lose top-down control over the emotion centers. So I switched to crying, and it's fine for geeks to cry, because crybabies can keep jobs, and I used to go hide in the electrical rooms and places like that, because I didn't want people to see that I was doing this. And I went to the saddest meeting. I went to this big high school convocation where I gave a talk about animal behavior, and a NASA scientist who was an engineering professor at the university gave a talk, and you know the shuttle program's shutting down, and he had these beautiful slides just flashing up behind him of the shuttle assembly building, and he started crying because the shuttle's being canceled. I was crying too. You know, that's the sort of stuff where, you know, if you're geek, you get really, really choked up over that. And I think that's something that's hard for some of the more social people to understand that, you know, you can get that emotional about, you know, your project dying. Let's go to the next. Oh, what are the two things that encourage parents who have a child with autism? First of all, early intervention. And in USA Today, there's an article in there about a checklist for detecting possible autism in year-old babies. You know, babies that don't respond to people looking at them. They don't smile. They don't play peekaboo. They don't do the interactive games. That's the first early warning sign that the kid might have autism. So what do you do with that kid? You want to engage them. I can't emphasize enough the importance of working with very young children, engaging them. When I was 2.5, I went into very good early intervention. I had a nanny who played constant turn-taking games with me and my sister. We got to teach these kids to take turns. And in the 50s, things that were fun to do were things that involved taking turns. You know, if you had another kid over to play table hockey, you got to do it with somebody else. You have two kids over and we go make a play together. You know, when we put on some theater together, you got to cooperate with the other person. We got to teach the kids how to do these things. Early intervention. The other thing is develop the child's strengths. And then when they get into middle school, we're going to have to start thinking a lot more about careers. Because what I'm seeing, this really bothers me, being a visual thinker, I don't see the label. But the verbal people are getting too hung up on the label. And I'm going to say, one geek goes to Hollywood and he makes great movies. Boy, I saw a lot of them out at the Golden Globes. Another geek gets to go to Silicon Valley. I've been at a lot of conferences out there. I've seen him. And another geek's getting a label, and he's in the base, going to end up in the basement playing video games. That's not good. I would have been a video game addict. Why are these things so addicting? There's something about watching how the images move. If they were learning how to program the games, fine. I'd say, okay, we're going to limit the video game playing to an hour a day. If you want to spend 8 hours a day making a game, that's fine. Because that's something that can become your career, and we need to be thinking a lot more about what is this kid going to do. Mother was always pushing me. Okay, when I was in high school, I went to my aunt's ranch. Then when I was in college, she said, well, you can't no longer just go to the aunt's ranch all summer. She arranged other internships for me to do, like research lab. So I was getting job skills. Okay, well, thank you all for coming.